Welcome back to History 1301. This is Professor Tatum with yet another lecture for you. Here we got a good one. We're going to look at some people coming over from England to try to found a city upon a hill in the Americas, which will shine as an example for the rest of the world to see. Here we'll look at a little context as usual. Then we'll look at a group of individuals who we now call Puritan, as well as a specific sect of Puritans known as Separatists. We'll take a look at why these Puritans and Separatists chose to leave England, how they had aimed to form the city upon a hill, what measures they took to try to do so. We'll also take a look at this concept of religious freedom. So these Puritans and Separatists we're looking at are the individuals who we will later in history refer to as pilgrims. I'm sure all of us have heard at one point or another that the Pilgrims came and founded their colony in search of religious freedom. And that America has this long history of religious freedom, even before the United States was the United States. Part of the territory that would become the United States was founded on the basis of religious freedom, because we're all about freedom here in America. Yeah. Well, as we're going to see, their ideas of religious freedom were quite a bit different than ours. We'll leave it open to debate whether or not what we see play out here is actually by any means what we would consider to be religious freedom. We need to recap on a couple things as we jump into this lecture. Please remember that Virginia was already thriving by the time that anybody came here to Massachusetts. It was founded, remember, by the Virginia Company with the goal of making a good chunk of money in return. And it certainly did, as it profited from things like tobacco and cheap labor in the form of both indentured servants and enslaved labor. We also need to remember what happened with this Protestant Reformation. Remember, we had talked about how there was one official Christian church early on, which we now call the Roman Catholic Church. And we saw that for different reasons, various individuals were either kicked out of that church or chose to leave the church and formed their own versions of Christian churches. And we only looked at a few examples here, one of which was King Henry VIII breaking away from this church and forming the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church. And remember, though, King Henry VIII was the quote-unquote defender of the faith. So he was a pretty big fan of the Catholic Church for the most part. He really just broke away when he didn't get his way from the Pope. But the church he founded here would end up being very, very similar in many ways to this original Christian or Catholic Church. To kind of demonstrate how similar it is, I can tell a quick little story from my own personal life. When I was going into middle school, my parents wanted me to go to a Catholic school because we had some family friends going there. They realized it was affordable. So they said, yeah, why not? It could be good for you to get to that kind of education. Go give it a try. After the first 2 years, I realized I wanted to get out of there. But I'm very glad I had the experience. I learned a lot from it. And when I mean I learned a lot from it, a lot of what I learned is that what my parents sent me for there quite the opposite. All right. Let me tell you, throughout my life, I've gone to lots of punk rock shows, kind of grew up in the punk rock scene. I've been all around the streets of Corpus. I have seen some things in my life, okay? But those Catholic school kids, they kind of take the cake. They knew about all kinds of things that my public school friends and I had no clue about, all right? I knew all kinds of things by the end of 7th grade that not many parents want their 12-year-old boy knowing about, all right? Anyway, side note there. Reason I get into that story is because my mom was real concerned when I first started going there about what might happen when I went to the Catholic Mass. All right? She was afraid that I may find myself in a very uncomfortable situation because I wouldn't know what was going on in the Catholic Mass since I did not grow up in a Catholic church. I actually grew up in the American version of this church. Okay, so basically, years down the road, when members of this Church of England came to North America, they founded a church which they called the Episcopal or Episcopalian Church, which is very similar to this Church of England. So that's a church we need to keep in mind. That's 2 steps apart, hundreds of years down the road from the original Catholic Church. But what I found when I first went to that Mass of the Catholic Church is that I could have gone through that service with my eyes closed and been just fine, because it was so similar to the church that I had grown up in, all right, that Episcopalian church. So if we're talking about hundreds of years down the road, a church that's 2 steps apart here from the Catholic Church, we can only imagine how in the early days, how similar this Church of England must have been to that Catholic Church, right? And a lot of people within the Church of England didn't really like how similar it was, right? There were people who said, what was the point of breaking away from the church if we're going to do just about everything the same, right? There are, of course, some key differences, a couple which I pointed out in an earlier lecture, but very, very similar church here is the whole point I'm getting at. And there were a group of individuals in particular who wanted to purify that church from within, meaning they wanted to break it down to its bare bones level, and they wanted to scrub away some of those Catholic elements of the church that they didn't really care for. Right? These individuals have become known as Puritans. They were heavily inspired by the ideas of John Calvin, who had also broken away from the Catholic Church. So they were looking at ideas like pure and simple congregation in place of the complex church hierarchy. Right? They wanted a locally controlled congregation. They didn't want to have priests and bishops above them and the Pope above them. They also didn't like how ornate the church still was in a similar fashion to the Catholic Church, meaning that they didn't want a whole lot of material goods that were distracting, perhaps, from what they were there for. Right? They didn't like things like having gold chalices to present to the Eucharist or having paintings and icons of saints and stained glass. They thought all these material goods were distracting from the core reason that they were there, which was to read and discuss the scripture. They also took from John Calvin this idea of predestination. Remember, I brought that up briefly before. That's this idea that since God is all knowing, he is known from the dawn of time which human beings will be saved and which ones will not be saved. All right. And those who were destined for salvation believed that at some point throughout their life, God would reveal to them that they were among those who were saved. And they could bring that before the congregation and kind of make their case for here's how God revealed to me that I am among the saved. And if they all kind of agreed that, okay, this does add up with what we see here in scripture and it sounds convincing, that individual would be considered one of those among who they called the elect. Okay, so those who were destined for salvation and God had revealed it and the church agreed were referred to as the elect. So some of us may think with this idea of predestination, well, if it's already determined whether or not I'm going to heaven or hell, regardless of what I do, so I got a few sins I'd like to go try out. I'm going to go live it up out there and sin it up. That is not at all how they thought here, okay? They said, regardless, you should live a life that is pleasing to God, all right? And we should all strive to be visible saints. So we had seen these Puritans starting to push for purification and reformation of this Church of England from within. But there was one particular sect of Puritans who actually wanted to separate completely from the Church of England because they thought that the Church of England was too corrupt at this point that it could not be purified from within. So they needed to take these ideas that Puritans have and create their own church outside of the Church of England based on those beliefs. So put simply, separatists were just a branch of Puritans who wanted to completely separate, break away from the Church of England. And these Puritists and separatists would wind up leaving England, mainly because they had been challenging the Church of England and they had also been challenging the teachings of the Catholic Church. Now remember, the Church of England was run by the monarch of England, meaning the King or Queen of England. There was also times we saw throughout England's history where there would be Catholic monarchs who would restore Catholicism to England. So either way, Puritans found themselves at odds with the state religion. Okay, so by defying the Church of England and defying Catholicism, they were seen as rebelling against the monarchy. So they faced a lot of persecution in England. To escape that persecution, they decided to leave England. They didn't say, okay, we're going to search for religious freedom in the Americas. No, they said, we don't want to get arrested or get our heads cut off. Let's go to somewhere else. And they first went to the Netherlands. Okay? And they did okay in the Netherlands. And the only reason they wound up leaving the Netherlands is because they found that the culture in the Netherlands was just too different from what they were used to in England. And they didn't want to lose that sense of English identity, that sense of English culture. And they were afraid if they stood in the Netherlands where things were a bit different, they might lose that. So in order to try to maintain that, they instead ended up jumping aboard this ship here, the Mayflower, and heading toward where some of their fellow Englishmen were already settled in Virginia. By the way, quick note I've got to make before we move on. My direct paternal family, meaning my father's family, the Tatums, we can trace back our oldest relative, is a girl named Oceana Tatum, who rode on the Mayflower over to North America. This ship wound up sailing off course. Also, things weren't going so well aboard the ship. There's all kinds of conflict aboard, which way they should be steering, if they were on course, if they were not on course. There was disagreements between some of the Puritans and some of the separatists on board, and it looked like there may be some mutiny on this ship. And then some of them came together and said, guys, what are we doing? I understand we have some reasons we want to tear each other's heads off, but we all kind of jumped on this ship for a common reason, and we need to come back to that. And I think what we need to do here is make a written agreement with each other of what our purpose is for being on this ship. All right, so that we can all kind of get behind that common idea. And the agreement they made was known as the Mayflower Compact. So this is a written agreement between the Puritans and separatists aboard the Mayflower, in which they agreed that they would establish a civil body politic, meaning a system of self-government, which would be based on what they considered just and equal laws. So they're coming together to form this system of self-government. Now, it's pretty interesting here. They're talking about self-government, about forming a system of government, or civil body politic, as they call it. But it's pretty clear their allegiance was still to the King of England, all right? They talk here in this very first line about their sovereign lord, King James, all right? So they're still pledging loyalty to the King of England, showing that they still very heavily maintained their close ties to their English identity. Now, what's really significant here is that this not only was the first written framework of colonial self-rule, but it would also set a habit or precedence of self-rule among the English colonists, okay? So in earlier colonies like Virginia, there already had been some levels of representative government. In Virginia, they had what was called the House of Burgesses, which was a representative body of colonists. But after this writing here of this first real framework of colonial self-rule, these various colonial governing bodies would start to act more independently, right? And while they maintained their allegiance to England, and they certainly maintained their ties to their English culture, they did start to get in this habit of assuming that they had the right to make decisions among themselves and to rule themselves, okay? Pretty key document here that had all kinds of ramifications for American history moving forward. So the Puritans and Separatists would wind up founding two separate colonies here in North America. They would found a colony first in Plymouth, and then later they'd come and found a colony in Massachusetts Bay. Later down the road, they would merge into a single colony in Massachusetts. Their experiences in each of these colonies were similar in a lot of ways. They kind of bled into each other. So let's just go ahead and think of this all, for the sake of simplicity, as one colony in Massachusetts that they came to found. And the colonists here in Massachusetts from early on were very heavily dependent on indigenous people for survival. In particular, they depended on a group in the region known as the Wampanoags, led by a chief named Massasoit. And their go-between, or their intermediary in a sense, with the Wampanoags was an individual named Squanto. So Squanto was a pretty fascinating guy. He had been captured by some English sailors who had been out fishing along the coast of the Atlantic, and they took him to Europe where he was enslaved, and he ended up escaping from slavery. And he eventually was able to get on board a ship with some merchants and come back to the Americas. When he got back here to the Americas, he found that most of his local people had died of European diseases and other aspects of colonialism. So he ended up living more closely with another band of Wampanoag people, which were the band led by Massasoit. But since he'd been to Europe, spent some time there, he already knew how to speak English. So he acted as a translator and a guide between the English-speaking colonists and the Wampanoags under Massasoit. And the Wampanoags, including Squanto, taught these colonists basically everything they needed to know to survive in the region. Right? They taught them how to farm in this area, how to hunt in this area, and just generally how to survive. Another little side note I do need to throw in about Squanto. Sorry, not trying to get too off track here. But he was known to constantly let the English know that, hey, I'm a little worried that some of these people here may have placed a curse on you. But I can lift that curse for a small gift. And he'd collect a little something from them. He'd take all these presents to help protect them from evil spirits. Pretty clearly there, he's just stacking up the gifts. Good old Squanto. But what is really historically significant here about Squanto, Massasoit, and the Wampanoags? They were pretty clearly examples of the same thing we had seen with, for example, hey, look at that example, Doña Marina in the conquest of Mexico. Okay, they're clear examples of European dependence on indigenous support in colonial America, right? Example of European dependence on indigenous people's support in colonial America. And out of gratitude for their support that they had received from the Wampanoag, some of these colonists held a feast of Thanksgiving in which they shared food with the Wampanoag people of the region, and they partied it down for a few days and stuffed themselves silly, right? And that's where we get this holiday of Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving wouldn't actually be founded until well into the 19th century. President Lincoln founded it as a federal holiday, probably to ease the pressures of the Civil War and give people something to look forward to. But there is a great video here I'd like to share that kind of gives us some things to consider when we observe this holiday of Thanksgiving, right? And it helps us see that while we don't necessarily need to consider things like abolishing Thanksgiving or canceling Thanksgiving, we can still celebrate it while being mindful of some of the darker aspects of it, which are very real parts of our past that were linked directly to this event which we celebrate each year on this day. Let's go ahead and take a look at this video here.
With Thanksgiving holiday tomorrow, many Americans are celebrating with annual traditions, of course, including eating turkey, watching football, Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. But it is important for us also to acknowledge the harsh history of the holiday and some of the myths that surround it. And we'd like to bring in the author of This Land is Their Land, David Silverman, for more on this. David, thanks for being with us. Look, every country tells itself stories about itself, some of them truer than others, some of them less true. So talk about some of the myths behind Thanksgiving as you see it, and the story that we traditionally tell ourselves about this holiday.
Well, very good. So Americans attach this mythic story of pilgrims and Indians to the Thanksgiving holiday. And we're all familiar with the story. Friendly Indians welcome the Mayflower passengers to America, hand off their land, and then disappear. Suffice it to say, this is a rather rosy view of the history of colonialism, which, when you get right down to it, was a invariably bloody process.
Absolutely. The hundreds of years to this, continuing to this day, of the oppression of the native peoples of this continent. There was, however, a moment in the early going when the English people who came off the Mayflower were starving, and the Native Americans did take pity on them, basically, tried to help them out a little bit. Thanksgiving build out of that happy, upbeat holiday, but you bring up these important issues. Why is it important to have these conversations and talk about these more serious issues like the history of American politics concerning the native peoples here and how they shaped this country?
I think there's two reasons. One is that this country is built on a foundation of violent conquest of indigenous people. And that's a history that our history curricula at primary, secondary, even to a certain degree at the collegiate level, does not address. And it's understandable why many Americans are so loath to address that history. It's painful, it's difficult, and it makes many of us feel ashamed. And yet, confronting that history does two things that I think are productive for our society. I think first and foremost, it signals to indigenous people, our countrymen and women, that we value them as us, despite the fact that it was a colonial process that made them part of us. They are part of us now, though, and they have the right to see themselves in our nation's history and to see that history depicted accurately. The second thing that confronting this history does is it allows all of the rest of us to think critically about where our country comes from and how we want to reform our country so that it can move forward in a better way than perhaps our forebears performed.
Absolutely. Can I ask you, David, do you celebrate the Thanksgiving Day holiday, and how, and what do you bring to it?
Yeah, let me be perfectly clear about what I'm calling for here. I am not calling for us to cancel Thanksgiving. I'm not calling for a war on Thanksgiving. Nothing of the sort. I am a voracious pie eater, and thus Thanksgiving is among my favorite holidays. What I am suggesting is this, that we do not need to attach the false myth of friendly Indians welcoming colonists to take their land to this ritual of getting together with family and friends and offering thanks for what's good in our lives. We don't need to separate those two things. And indeed, I think it's worth noting that white Americans for most of the 1600s, 1700s, and early 1800s did not attach that mythic Thanksgiving story to the holiday. That's an invention of the 19th century. So I get together with family and friends. We binge on turkey and all of the fixings, and then, of course, on pie. And let me note here, too, among the many Native people that I know, a sizable portion of them also celebrate a traditional Thanksgiving. However, almost to a person, they also take a moment on that holiday to reflect on what their people have lost and why.
Absolutely. Let me conclude. Do you see progress in the way Americans understand these issues? I've got kids in school, and it does seem to me like these issues are being raised. Maybe it's just in this part of the country where my kids go to school, or maybe there is a greater degree of understanding that the American story is properly revised, is always revised, and that it is happening in our schools. Do you sense that?
To a degree. I think there's a push and pull going on right now, and of which we're all aware. On the one hand, if I ask most Americans, do you think that a shared meal is an appropriate symbol of colonial Native American relations? To a person, they will say no. I mean, they know it was a bloody business. The problem is they don't know the degree to which it was a bloody business. And the reason is this: though schools increasingly avoid trying to propagate this sugar-coated version of the Thanksgiving holiday, what they don't do is confront the messy reality of Native American history and United States Native American relations. We have come light years as a society when it comes to addressing African American history, but we've barely taken baby steps when it comes to addressing this country's history with indigenous people.
Lot of work to be done. And David Silverman, we want to thank you for being with us, and happy Thanksgiving.
And to you and yours. Thank you.
All right.
All right. Excellent overview there. I think definitely demonstrates kind of the complexity of grappling with history in the present, while being able to see that, yes, there are some very disturbing elements of here that we need to be mindful of, and consider how we approach those types of issues in the present day without necessarily shutting it down or hiding it or brushing it under the rug. There's other historians who will suggest that this perhaps was not the first Thanksgiving. You know, as damn historians, we have this awful agenda where we just want to go change our history and we want to ruin our great American traditions. So let's see how, based on clear evidence, some historians will suggest that perhaps the first Thanksgiving actually took place in Texas.
Where and when did the very first Thanksgiving happen? That depends who you ask. Some say it happened in Texas, 23 years before the Pilgrims had their famous dinner at Plymouth Rock. The year was 1598. Spanish explorer Juan de Oñate was given land among the Pueblo Indians by the Viceroy of Spain. He led an expedition of 500 people, which included soldiers, colonists, wives and children, and 7,000 livestock. The group had to cross the Chihuahuan Desert to get to the land in the Rio Grande Valley. They were challenged by torrential rain and drought during their 50-day journey, and by the last 5 days, they had run out of food and water. According to records, both animals and humans went mad with thirst before the party reached water. 2 horses drank until their stomachs burst, and 2 others drowned in the river in their haste to consume as much water as possible. On April 30th of that year, after surviving the journey, Oñate ordered a day of Thanksgiving. Their feast included fish supplied by the Pueblo in the area. Some historians say this date marks the beginning of Spanish colonization in the American Southwest.
All right, so there is something there that could be considered a type of Thanksgiving feast involving both European colonists and Native Americans that far predates this Thanksgiving here in Plymouth. But there are other historians who suggest that the real Thanksgiving may go even further back. If we look at the first permanent established European colony in the present-day United States, which is in St. Augustine, Florida.
Menendez christened the new settlement San Agustin, or St. Augustine. It was September 8th, 1565.
Traditionally, the Spanish representative, the king, would go to the flag, plant the flag in the ground, and proclaim the land in the name of the king. He, however, went over to Father Lopez and knelt down and kissed the cross. So he proclaimed the land in nombre de Dios, in the name of God, before the name of his king.
And Lopez observed the natives imitated all they saw done. Now there is a picture for you.
Father Lopez then conducted a Mass of Thanksgiving, and Menendez ordered that a meal be prepared for everyone, including the natives. This was 55 years before the Pilgrims even arrived in Plymouth. A few years ago, Dr. Michael Gannon drew fire when he called this meal the true first Thanksgiving.
There was a guy who called me from WBZ in Boston. He said, "While I'm talking, do you realize that there's an emergency meeting of select men at Plymouth to contend with this new information that there were Spaniards in Florida before there were Englishmen in Massachusetts?" And then he said, "Well, you know how you've become known up here in New England?" I said, "No." He said, "The Grinch who stole Thanksgiving."
All right, so there's a little food for thought for you guys that you can enjoy along with your food that you eat on Thanksgiving while being mindful of what all was linked to it in the reality of our past. All right. And no, I'm joking when I talk about changing our history. That's never the goal here. We're simply having fun in this case, but really in most cases, trying to grapple with various perspectives and different pieces of evidence that come to light as history is studied. All right, moving forward. So these pilgrims, as we now call them, the Puritans and Separatists who came to found their colonies in Massachusetts, aimed to do so by creating a model city upon a hill. This phrase was coined, of course, by Governor John Winthrop in his sermon, which you guys read, A Model for Christian Charity. And what he meant by this was to create a model society that would inspire England and the rest of the world to adopt their customs, all right? They were going to be so successful and they were going to be so godly that other nations and other peoples would look to them and say, wow, we should be living like this too. So how did they aim to create this city upon a hill? What kind of actions would they take in order to try to construct this model city that they wanted to create? Well, first off, they would combine church and state. They created a colonial governing body known as the General Court, and the only people who could participate in the General Court were visible saints, okay, meaning people who were approved of by the church as living good, godly lives. Right? Primarily, members of the General Court were the elect, meaning those who were saved and have had some kind of revelation of salvation. They also placed a heavy emphasis on family. Remember in Virginia, we saw primarily young men for quite some time. Well, here in Massachusetts, they're going to take a much different approach. They're going to encourage people to come and settle here as families, right, and as communities. There's going to be a very strong emphasis on that family and community structure. They would also push for public education to help educate their society, but also to teach them about the kinds of values and Christian beliefs that they wanted to be prevalent within their society. They also founded some universities. So, for example, Harvard College was actually founded as a college that could provide not only a kind of classical education, but also provide religious education and train individuals to become religious leaders. So it's very clear there is a basis of religion here in this colony. Right? It's also clear that the Puritans and Separatists, who we now refer to as Pilgrims, who had left England and came and founded this colony in Massachusetts, came here to escape religious persecution that they were facing in England. But did they really come here with the goal of creating religious freedom? Now, they certainly do seem to want the freedom to practice their version of Christianity, but I think a lot of times when we use this term religious freedom, we get ideas of religious toleration, right? Of people having the freedom to worship however they see fit. Now, that does not seem to line up with what we end up seeing here in colonial Massachusetts, okay? They want people to have the freedom to practice religion the way they like. But let's take a look at what happens to individuals who practice in a different manner. If we looked at people like Roger Williams. So Roger Williams, as you guys know, was a pretty loud critic of two key issues within colonial Massachusetts. He really didn't like their treatment of Native Americans and this idea that colonists had the inherent right to indigenous people's lands. He thought that they should offer payment for any land they were taking from Native peoples, and they did not have the kind of right to go take the land with things like we had seen in Bacon's Rebellion. And he also did heavily push for religious toleration. Right? He said that we should not be forced to abide by this Puritanism. If we interpret the scripture in a different way, we should have conversations about how we interpret it. If people have different spiritual and religious beliefs, they should share those ideas with each other. He said, as human beings, there's no way for a person to know whether or not they have it 100% right. So if they feel that God or that some higher power has spoken to them in some way, we should hear what they have to say, because maybe we're just blinding ourselves to a message that's trying to come across to us by being so closed-minded. All right, that's put into 21st century English, but those are along the lines of the types of things that he was speaking up for. And for those issues, he was banished from the Massachusetts colony. Now, several of you also pointed out, even though it's not what was stated where I was asking you to get the answer from, that he also opposed the idea of having the church and the state so closely interlinked. Now, that only really makes sense if we understand this context of colonial Massachusetts, right? They're creating the city upon a hill where government and state kind of blend together. So by speaking out against that, he's basically speaking out against the whole basis of their society. All right, and this led to him being banished from the colony. So here's a pretty clear example of a guy who didn't do things the exact way that the Puritan leaders of the society wanted to see, and he was not tolerated, right? He was kicked out of the colony. Then there was the case of Anne Hutchinson, you guys should also know a little bit about by now. She was a very influential Puritan woman, and she preached some pretty controversial ideas, right? She started having church services at her home in which she would share these kind of radical, for the time, ideas. There was a lot of hypocrisy within the Puritan community in Massachusetts. And then a lot of the religious leaders in the region were suggesting that people could earn God's salvation by doing certain works or certain actions, certain practices that were favorable to their community. She said that that stood very firmly against what she interpreted from the scripture and from ideas like predestination, which Puritans in theory stood for, which suggested that the only way a person could receive salvation was through God's grace. She also said that people should be less concerned with the laws set by man, as long as they were abiding by the laws of the scripture, that they were okay, and that any laws they violated in the process, well, at least they were following the higher law. This idea of being willing to violate the laws of man because you believe that you're following a higher law, by the way, we call it antinomianism. She also spoke out against the subservience that women were expected to take on in Puritan society. Saying that women are human beings just like men, so why are they expected to quiet down and serve men, and why are they not treated more like God's children the way that men are? She also questioned whether or not some of the government and church leaders were actually members of the elect. And as we saw, for speaking out against all these things, her and her family were kicked out of the colony. And if you remember what happened to her and her family, they went and tried to settle down near New York, and they ran into some hard times with some local Indians who ended up killing her and her entire family. So not a happy story there for Anne Hutchinson. So that's two clear examples now of individuals who were not accepted within Puritan society because their religious beliefs differed from what the leaders of this quote-unquote city upon a hill wanted to see practiced religiously. Another very clear example we can see of some limits being placed on where people may have not had the freedom to practice religion in certain ways is through the Salem witch trials. So this was based on a fear that there were elements of perhaps pagan religions or satanic influence among some of the people of Massachusetts. And people were being accused of committing witchcraft, which they claimed was counter to the teachings of God and the teachings of their beliefs, and therefore was unacceptable in their society. They began holding a series of trials of individuals who were suspected of witchcraft. in which they had to plead their case, and it was determined whether or not they were actually in link with the devil or in link with any form of witchcraft. And if they were, they would most likely be executed. But people started to find a way that they could get off the hook from execution in many cases, was to make a confession. Say, okay, yes, I did perform some version of witchcraft, but it's only because a spell was cast on me. Okay, I wasn't actually the one controlling it all. It was this other person in the community who put a spell on me, and it's because of them that I committed witchcraft. All right. So then that other person would be brought onto trial. This person would be let off the hook, and the community would probably keep a close eye on them, say some prayers for them, but they'd at least escape execution. But over time, as people began finding that they could just make a confession and accuse somebody else of witchcraft in order to get off the hook, some people started to use this to their advantage in very kind of questionable ways. All right. So, if, for example, somebody was brought to trial and they had some kind of grudge against somebody else in their community, they would say, "Oh, that person over there I have a grudge with. They're the one who got me practicing witchcraft. Why don't you bring them on up to trial?" All right. And then that puts them on the line. So this did start to be used, and it's kind of a political weapon between various members of the community who had resentments against one another. That's where we get that term witch hunt. People start using this situation to cause harm to their rivals within society, and people are hesitant to question it because there's such a widespread fear around this incident, which in this case is quite literally suspected witchcraft. So this was no small matter. As a result of this mass hysteria here that formed, as we see, out of a kind of intoleration of suspected spiritual practices which were counter to Puritanism, there were about 200 people who were accused of witchcraft and brought to trial. And about 10% of them, so about 20 total, were executed. The majority of them were hanged by the neck. There was one individual who was pressed to death with a bunch of heavy stones. This was all brought to an end, though, when the governor's wife was accused of witchcraft. Then all of a sudden the governor said, "Okay, guys, maybe we're taking this a little out of hand. Honey, go home and lock the door." All right. Isn't that convenient that once the governor has something on the line, suddenly we should sit here and question whether or not this is a reasonable thing to do? We can clearly see here, though, main point I want us to understand about this is that it's a clear example of a lack of religious toleration. Okay, there's this big hysteria, this big fear of some other kind of spiritual force that may exist within the region, and it's feared to such an extent that people are accusing one another of doing it to get themselves on the hook, and that people are being brought to trial and executed in these large numbers we see here. So why was there this suspected witchcraft in the first place, though? A lot of it had to do with people acting unusually or making statements that were a bit unusual, kind of talking about things they had maybe seen or imagined. People would maybe have some kind of fits where they'd act real strange or do some things physically that were a little unusual. And historians have come up with several explanations for really why there were those suspected cases of witchcraft in the first place, as well as why this got so out of hand. So on one hand, we know that Puritans tried to use all kinds of supernatural explanations to explain things that they couldn't quite understand. So, for example, when milk would spoil, they'd say, "Oh, it's because fairies must have gotten into the milk." So perhaps some of the things they were seeing people do, they didn't know how to explain, so they just said that must be witchcraft, right? So anytime somebody did something or said something or spoke about something they imagined that could not be explained, well, a very simple solution to make sense of it could simply be to say, "Oh, well, that must be witchcraft." There also were very likely elements of legitimate Wiccan and pagan religions that were somewhat practiced by certain people in the region and were largely misunderstood and not tolerated by Puritans. Another common explanation that students usually get a good kick out of is that these people were all quite literally probably just tripping, all right? So there were certain funguses that were growing on crops in the area that would cause hallucinations. It was so intense and so poisonous that in some cases it would even lead to mass deaths of livestock. Okay, so when this would happen and people and their livestock would be eating this, all these people would see is that this one person is acting a little nuts because they're on a psychedelic trip. All right, they're saying things that don't really make much sense to anybody else. They're acting a little differently, and then all around them, their livestock who are also eating that fungus are starting to die off. So people assume, okay, this person's acting different and all their livestock's dying. They start using these kind of explanations here and saying, well, that must be because they're possessed by a witch, and those demon witch spirits that are possessing them are also killing off all their livestock. All right. Now, in terms of explanation for why this all got so carried away and out of hand, there's likely a lot of class tensions involved here. In many cases, if the poor individual was brought to trial, they would try to get off the hook by accusing somebody a little wealthier, or vice versa. A wealthy person would accuse somebody poorer. There were also some generational feuds here, largely linked to spiritual and religious differences. Older generations, in many cases, felt that members of the younger generation weren't taking religion as seriously as they should. And as a result, they said, well, if there's anything evil and questionable going on around here, it must be because they've allowed us to stray from God. There's also certainly issues of gender here at play. The majority of people who were accused were women, all right? Gender certainly does seem to be at play as well. But regardless, this is just a little side note. I know students get interested in this topic, so I figured I'd spend a few minutes breaking down some key explanations for what really was likely going on here. But I want us to come back to this question. Was this colony founded by the Pilgrims founded with the goal of creating religious freedom? Now, I'll leave that for you to interpret, but based on the evidence here, I interpret it to be more that it was founded on a basis of people trying to escape religious persecution, but not so much on a basis of religious freedom. You could perhaps make the argument that they did want freedom to practice their form of Puritanism, but that's about as far as it went. Okay, we could see with people like Roger Williams and Ann Hutchinson, and like the individuals who were suspected of participating in witchcraft, that their religious and suspected spiritual and religious beliefs were not tolerated when they stood counter to what the Puritans expected. And they were willing to do things like kick people out of the colony, putting them sometimes in life-threatening situations, or in other cases to bring them to trial and to sentence them to death. But again, this is a clear example of historical interpretation based on evidence, and like a good historical interpretation, it is contestable. So leave it for you guys to decide. Was this colony here founded on the goal of creating religious freedom? All right, guys, we'll go ahead and leave this here. Let me know if you got any questions. Otherwise, this is it for now. Over and out.